Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the library at Glade Central High School. We are so excited today to have Holocaust survivor Allan Hall speak to you. First, I would like to thank Kim Coombs, who is the Holocaust Studies Planner, and she is going to speak to you now.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for your dedication to making this happen for Glade Central today. I'm honored to be with you as you witness living history. I just want to give you a moment of why it's important to hear from a survivor. Firsthand accounts from individuals who lived through genocide help us to more deeply appreciate and empathize with the human and inhuman dimensions of the Holocaust. It supplements what you're learning in books by offering a unique perspective on the difficult situations that individuals were forced to confront during these moments of collective violence. I want to just read a quote from Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel, the author of the book Night. Wiesel says, "The idea of telling these stories is to sensitize people, that you should become more sensitive to yourselves, to your friends, even to strangers. Become sensitive, not only to the story of what we try to tell, but about what happens even today, because what happens even today is always related to what happened then." Elie Wiesel also said, "Whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. It is our job to pass it on, as today we all become a witness." If you have any questions or comments, your teachers have a Google form that they received that they can share with you to ask questions or make comments for Mr. Hall, and he will try to answer them as time allows at the end. I would like to introduce Mr. Gerard Loeb. He's the chairman of the Speakers Bureau for an organization called Next Generations of Holocaust Survivors. He has been facilitating these survivor talks in our high schools, and we are grateful and really appreciate his support. So thank you, Mr. Loeb, for supporting the Palm Beach County Schools and Glade Central today.
Thank you, Kim. I will introduce today a very special survivor to you. Special because he was a child. He was a very young child when the war started. He was 4 years old when the Nazis invaded his home country of Poland. And his story is unique. I would say, like many stories of those who survived that very dark chapter of history. But Allan was living in Cracow with his family at the time when the Nazis were invading Poland. And I would say that he escaped arrest, imprisonment, deportation, and death for sure. Thanks to, first, I would say, his dad. He had a father who spoke fluently German. And from what I understand, his dad was an energetic man who could make a decision on the spur of a moment. And I think that is what saved Allan, his dad, and his mother. Later on, his younger brother, who was born a little bit later. So I would say that to summarize the story that Allan will tell you, I would refer to the title of his memoir. He wrote a memoir on his experience called Hidden in Plain Sight. And I think that in a sentence summarizes very, very well the ordeal of the whole family, the fact that he lived with his mom in a closet for about 2 years and in various places, trying to flee ahead of the Nazis that were looking for Jews to exterminate them. So without any further ado, I'll introduce my good friend, Allan Hall.
Good morning. When I am asked to speak, especially when I'm asked to speak to younger people, the first thing that crosses my mind is, why would you want to listen to me? Why would you want to hear something about the Holocaust? After all, it happened 75 years ago. It happened to a bunch of old folks, most of whom are dead. It doesn't affect you. It's not your problem, not your issue. Well, a couple of thoughts. And besides, United States, things are going well here. Everything's fine, right? Well, in Poland, my grandparents in 1935 came to the United States with the idea that maybe they would join their two sons who were living in New York and live in the United States. After being in U.S. for a month, they went back to Poland. And the reason? Life was better in Poland than in New York. So, why would you want to listen? You're doing great, right? Well, have you looked at the paper news lately? This person's getting abused. That person's getting murdered. Not because of what they did, because of who they are. So maybe life is not so perfect. But it can't happen to you. Well, that's what we thought. And that's where my story starts. I was in Cracow, 4.5 years old. Everything was fine. And all of a sudden, I heard my parents argue. Now, my parents were kind of aspiring upper class folks. And fighting and arguing was impermissible in our home. And so to hear my parents arguing, that was something different, something new, something I never heard before. And the gist of the argument was something like this. Dad said, I was educated in Vienna. I read German newspapers, periodicals. And I know what Hitler has in mind for us Jewish people. By the way, both of my parents were non-observant Jews. So, but that made no difference to the Nazis. So we need to leave here, and I want to go east towards Russia. His hometown was Lvov, which is now Ukraine, further east, almost at the edge of Russia, Soviet Union in those days. Mom said, that's ridiculous. The Germans are good people. This Hitler, he's just a lunatic. He'll pass, nothing to worry about. Germans, my gosh, 1/4 of the people in our town were of German descent. We had Germans in our family. They're good folks. It's not, what are you scared of? And this argument went on and on and on until one moment, my dad said, if I can't persuade you, I can't. But I'm going to take the boy. And I was the only child my parents had, the only grandchild of my mother's family. And we're going to Lvov in eastern Poland. And my mother was utterly shocked. What do you mean you're taking a child? You can't take my son away from me. And my father grabbed me by the hand and started dragging me out the door. My mother stopped, started crying, and they said, "You really leaving?" Yes. Well, let me just say goodbye to my parents and go. The only time that I've ever seen or heard my father say anything unkind to my mother was at that moment when he said, no goodbyes, we're leaving now. And crying, my mom grabbed a stroller, put the family album and her fur coat in a stroller and the silver that we had, flatware, and off we went.
Allan?
At that time, the first thing that breaks down in any war zone is public transportation. No trains, there were no buses. We couldn't even hire a taxi to go from one place to the other. To give you a sense of how far we went, it was approximately from where you are to Tampa, Florida. And the only way we could get there is by walking. No, there were no buses, no way of other way other than walking. It took us probably about 3 or 4 weeks to walk that distance. We didn't even have a sandwich with us. We would knock on people's doors. Some people would feed us. Others turned us away. Some people would give us a place to sleep. Others did not. But after a while, we wound up coming to a river, and there were no bridges. My parents could not swim. And so the only way we could get across that river is there was a ferry. We walked up to the ferry, and it was a little boat, just big enough to hold a horse and a cart attached to the horse. And on one side was a line of people, and the other side was another line of people. We stood single file and hanging onto the cart. And on one end, there was a man pushing us across the river with a big long pole. On the other, there was a rope tied across the river, and he was pulling us along the rope. That's the way we got across the river. Well, when we crossed that river, what we didn't realize, we crossed from death to life. We left the Nazi-controlled part of Poland and entered the Soviet-controlled part of Poland. The Soviets weren't so great, but they weren't killing people just because they existed.
Russians.
And shortly afterwards, we joined my father's mother. He got a job. We got an apartment. Life went back to normal very easily and very quickly. Every day, my mother would write a letter to her sister, to her mother, to her father. My mother died in 1993, and she never received a single answer to these letters. They were not returned, and they were not answered. And when she died, she had no idea why there was never a response. I, after several trips to Poland, found out. You see, the Germans rounded up all the Jews in Cracow, in the area where we were, brought them to a square where we visited. From that square, they, From that square, they took him by truck to a concentration camp called Plaszow at the edge of Cracow. And from that camp, they took them mostly to Auschwitz. The reason my mother never got a reply, because she was writing to dead people. Back to the story. Remember, can it happen here? That's the question. Life was very, very good in Poland, just as good as here now. Can it happen here? At any rate, we lived comfortably for 20 months, not knowing what was going on the other side. And in June of 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviets. The Soviets withdrew, and all of a sudden the Germans were in control. I'm sure your teachers will tell you when I speak of Nazis and Germans, and I speak of Soviets and Russians, the differences between them. At any rate, we knew well enough to maintain a low profile without my father's urging, and all was going fine. Well, maybe a week or 2 or 3, maybe a month, not very long. And all of a sudden, we got a 3x5 card, and the card simply said, "You have to leave the contents of your apartment intact. You take one suitcase, and you have to go to another apartment." We had no idea what that meant, what that was all about. But we had no choice. We moved to the other apartment, and when we opened the doors, what a shock. There was another family in the other apartment. Well, we couldn't quite figure it out, but we had no choice. We were not given any alternatives. And so we made the best we could. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. The family that was there before had the master bedroom. We took the small bedroom. And we kept quiet and stayed out of the way. And within a day, 2 or 3, a third family moved in. They also had no choice. Well, what do you think was happening to us? We had no idea. We never heard the word ghetto. It was an unfamiliar term to us. We were being moved into the ghetto. We, somewhat voluntarily, with our own feet, moved into the ghetto. And almost immediately when we were in that part of town, bad, terrible things started happening. Beatings on the streets, people were getting shot, there was no food, and on and on and on. Meanwhile, my dad had a good job. He had a pass, so he could come and go. And he would see all these terrible things on the street. Mom and I stayed in the room. He came back with a little few morsels of food he could. And one of these back and forth trips, he was warned that there would be a roundup of children. Out of an abundance of caution, not even knowing what that was, he found a safe house in the country and hired a railroad worker to take me there. As we were walking down the street towards the railroad station, right in front of me, a truck pulled up and Germans started jumping off the back of the truck, military people. We tried to walk the other way, and that other end of the street was blocked by a different truck. And because I was on the street, I was the very first shell taken in Lvov on that children's roundup. I was put on the back of the truck, and then as I sat in the back of the truck, I could hear the screams, the cries, the pleadings when the children were being wrestled away from their parents in the various buildings up and down the street. As they were coming out, usually holding 2 children, one in each hand, and putting them on the truck with me. Well, when the truck was full, 2 Germans jumped in the back of the truck. They were in uniform with rifles, and off we went to somewheres. I always thought it was a police station, but now I'm inclined to think that it was a concentration camp, because I found out there was a concentration camp on the edge of Lvov ghetto. And we were taken out of there and put into a corral. Well, there was a wall that was about 3 foot high with glass above it, and I was tall enough to see above through the glass. I stood right next to the glass, and I was so glad after a couple hours I saw my dad walk in. He saw me because I made sure that my face was right next to the glass. Our eyes locked. He went up to talk to the head Nazi, talked to him for a couple of minutes, never even looked at me after that, turned around and walked out. I knew that I was in a whole lot of trouble if I was in German hands. I kept my mouth shut, never caused a bit of trouble. And that way I knew I was going to get beaten up or shot. And several hours later, I wasn't quite as happy as the first time I saw my dad come back. I figured he abandoned me once. Who knows? He might abandon me again. He spoke for a few moments with the same head Nazi, who turned around and walked away. My father took that as consent, looked at me, beckoned me to join him, and we walked out of there. About a year ago, when I was interviewed for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I learned from my interviewer that I'm the only known survivor of the various child roundups that occurred in Europe. I can still see the faces of the children that would be kept with me, and I guess I will take those faces with me to the grave, to my grave. At any rate, we walked out of there, maintained low profile. And then my dad, who spoke brilliant German because he was educated in Vienna, and he was hanging around with a Nazi. And by the way, the reason why he could hang around with a Nazi is he went to a physician who was a friend of his. And he said, "See this nose? This is my death warrant. Give me a nice, small, little nose so I don't look Jewish. And give me a nose job, a rhinoplasty." And the doctor said, "I can't take a Jewish person to the hospital." Jews were not permitted in the hospitals. Jews were not even permitted in parks. And my dad said, "Well, why don't you do it in your home? You got your own little black bag, you got tools with you, etc." And the doctor said, "I carry no anesthetic. I don't have a full supply of tools. I don't have an assistant." And so my dad said, "Look, my wife is totally dependent upon me. If you don't do it, not only will I die, but so will my wife." The doctor was a good guy. He said, "No, I would love to, but can't do it." Well, at any rate, my dad thought for a moment and said, he pulled his ace card. He said, "I have a 7-year-old son. If my wife and I die, he has no chance of survival." So the doctor thought about it. Make a long story short, my dad came to his home that night. His anesthetic, half a bottle of vodka. He chugged it down, and the doctor started cutting into his nose. Pretty gruesome. My dad had to help him sometimes with his tools. He held a tray underneath to pick up the shards of bone and other tissue in the nose. He got sewn up, and he left there. He walked out of there, went home, healed in about a week or so, and it was a brilliant job. He wasn't pretty after that. He looked like a retired boxer. His nose was flattened out, but he certainly didn't look Jewish. And to look even less Jewish, my dad dyed his hair blonde, and there he was, German-speaking blonde, with a boxer's nose. Nobody ever thought that he might be Jewish. So he was hanging around with a Nazi who said, and it's his headquarters building, I've got this 2-room suite of offices, and I'm paying rent day after day after day, and I'm sick and tired of it. Very nonchalantly, my dad said, "I got a little factory. I can use that office." So he sublet that office, and for the next 2 years, it was a 2-room office. My mother and I hid in a closet in a private office in a Nazi headquarters building. And he would come and go, trying to make $1 here and there. Actually, it was a mark. And he would bring us a little bit of food. And all we had in that closet were 2 pillows. The purpose of the pillow was not for comfort. If we had to cough and sneeze or anything, you put the pillow in your face so as to muffle the sound. And because there were people working all around us who could hear us. That building still stands. That room is still there. I visited it as recently as about 18 months ago. We had a potty, and that's all there was in that room. Oh, with the exception of, I had a little bit of white string, and hour after hour after hour, we played cat in the cradle. And that's where one person holds the string between his or her hands, and the other person makes a design, and you go back and forth until you get a very intricate design. And each time the design can be different. And that's about the only thing we had to occupy our time. We were never discovered that closet, even though the closet wasn't locked, for 2 years, until the Polish people tried to liberate their own city. The Soviets were on the verge, right at the edge of Warsaw. This was in Warsaw. We had moved to Warsaw. And so the Polish people tried to liberate their own capital, which is Warsaw. And they started fighting. And so the Germans lost control of that part of town. The Polish, and they were bombing buildings. And the Polish air raid warden found us in a closet, insisted we go down the basement. We were not in the basement for very long when a bomb penetrated the entire 16-story building, wound up in the basement with us. Had that bomb exploded, we would have been vaporized, but it didn't. But we were not sure when it might explode or whether, so we had to go to another bomb shelter about 3, 7, or 4 blocks away. We crawled under sniper fire along barricades to the other bomb shelter. And there, as far as I was concerned, I was always right next to my mother, close enough to where I could touch her. And all of a sudden, they moved my mother away about maybe 30 feet, and they hung a sheet between us. I was panic-stricken until I heard my mother say, "You're okay, you're fine, you're safe. I'm fine too, don't worry, everything's gonna be okay." Every once in a while, she would say something to me. And after a while, I heard something that I've never heard before. Remember, I'm the only child, and I have not been in any place where there are any animals. Basically, my entire childhood was spent amongst adults. And all of a sudden, I heard what I thought was a cat screeching. Well, those were the birth sounds of my baby brother, who was born with a birth weight of less than 2 pounds, small enough where you can hold him in the palm of your hand. And because of malnutrition, my mother had no milk to offer. There were no other women nursing. And the prognosis for my brother was that he was going to die immediately. One doctor, so there were several doctors came by to look at this very, very tiny baby. One doctor came by and said, "Well, if you think that you have to do something for this baby, give him some sugar water." As soon as I realized that my brother was born, I thought his birth was my death, because we passed at that point for 4 years by not being seen, by not being heard, with a newborn baby, attention is always attracted to the newborn. It turns out I was exactly wrong. All the people in Warsaw had to leave. The Germans destroyed the entire city. They said for anybody who stays, they die with the buildings. And one doctor who wanted to save us, save the baby, said, well, first of all, he said, give him some sugar water. Well, that was kind of weird because we hadn't seen sugar for nearly 4 years. There was the one thing that was rationed that was not available to us at all. And if there is such thing as miracles, this is when it occurred to us. A bag of sugar showed up. Even today, I cannot tell you from where. So we were able to mix a little bit of sugar with some sugar water and give it to my brother. And amazingly, he lived. He did not die. And then, in order to save that baby, a physician put us on a hospital train out of Warsaw. The reason why that was such a special event, everybody had to go through checkpoints. We did not have current papers. So at a checkpoint, we would have been pulled out of the line and right there shot on the spot. But we didn't have to, people in hospital settings did not have to go to checkpoints. So we were taken to the train, put on the train, a bandage up my mother's face. So she looked like she was hit with shrapnel. I came along, I was told to sit still, keep quiet, keep my head down, And as always, I passed in plain sight. And that train we thought was going to Germany, but in fact, that train went to Cracow. But I skipped a very important point. Before going to the high-rise building, we were hiding again in plain sight by going to some. Everybody was desperate for money, so we snuck out of the ghetto, got false identification papers to indicate that we were Christian rather than Jewish, and we would rent a room somebody's house, stay there for a few days, go to a room somebody's apartment, stay there for a few days, and on and on and on. Well, one landlady got suspicious. Now, it was a capital crime to hide a Jewish person. And so,
What does that mean?
if you hide a Jewish person, if you're lucky, you get shot on the spot. If you're less lucky, you get sent to a concentration camp, there to be worked to death. And if you're really unlucky, your entire family went to a concentration camp. So that was the penalty. So we certainly would not blame somebody for being scared to house us. But this lady did not tell us to go away as she could easily have. We had no property, no nothing. We could have left in 30 seconds. What she did, she called the police. The police came and very courteously said, well, we got to take you downtown. I assumed that was the police station. I have since learned there was a ghetto right very close to where we were. And we were taken to the German headquarters, the Gestapo headquarters. Now, the Gestapo was the worst of the worst. They were the real bad guys. And we were right in front of that building. I found that building probably in 2003. At any rate, we sat outside waiting while one of the cops went in for instructions. And he came out and he said, oh, I'm supposed to take you to a railroad station across the street. We went to that railroad station and the train had just pulled out. All the place was empty. Well, people started coming in, and more people and more people. And we were there for 2.5 days. After a while, railroad stations are big places. After a while, the railroad station was so full that it was literally people were standing shoulder to shoulder. And being a little kid, I would try to run around, etc., bump into people. And so the Polish police, the German police, the Jewish police, all three of them got together and decided to take us, the more lively or perhaps obnoxious children, and take us to an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I was taken there with about 100 other children. And we were playing there, having a good time. I enjoyed it until a man showed up in uniform, and I never trusted anybody in uniform. And he said, I'm here to take you to your parents. I was not going with that man. I didn't know who he was. I didn't trust him. Well, he saw that there was no way he could convince me. And so he went to the adults, whom I loved, who were very kind, very nice. And he said something to them. They walked me outside of the orphanage. Next thing I knew, the door behind me was locked. And I was there, I was alone with this man. He said, he put a cap on my head, pulled the brim way down. He said, whatever you do, don't look up. Don't look up. Hold my hand, don't let go. And say nothing. And we walked down the main street of the Warsaw Ghetto, right to the police station. I saw a pedestal and a pair of boots. That's all I saw because I couldn't look up. And the guard, I looked down and I said, who are you? What are you doing here? And my savior, a Polish person, Polish Christian person, said, I'm here because I wanted to show my son these Jewish people. There was a pause, and the card said, "You must be stupid. It's almost curfew. If the patrols catch you in the street after curfew, they shoot on sight. Run home and pray that you can get home before the patrols get you." And see, folks, that's the way I was snuck out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Man was good to his word, dropped me off at my parents', and disappeared. In those days, nobody gave anybody their true name or address. And so if the Nazis would have caught us, we could not give him help. We didn't know who he was. To this day, I cannot thank him or his family for having saved me. All I can do is send the best thoughts I possibly can and hope that only good things happen to them, to him and his family. He's probably long dead, but certainly to his family. At any rate, back to where we were put on the train. We were sure the train was going to Germany, but we had no choice. In fact, the train went to Cracow. And by that time, unknowingly, my father was involved with the Polish underground. When we arrived in Cracow, the Polish underground met my dad, found us a safe house, and we were there for the next 3 months, actually 4 months, where we were liberated. And so that's essentially, in very short terms, with very few details, my story of survival. I'm trying purposely to save time for you to ask me questions. And by the way, I ask questions. I welcome questions. I want you to hear this. No questions out of line. No questions out of bounds. And I would urge your teachers to give you the link to my memoir and also to give you my phone number and my email address. And if anybody wants to contact me later on, please feel free to do so. And at this point, I'm going to stop and ask for a few questions.
Thank you, Allan. Wow. Your experience. I'm kind of shell-shocked right now. I do have a question from a student in the library who is wondering about your brother and if your brother survived.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Not only did he survive, but he had an outstanding life. My brother grew up, overcame his birth weight, was a big guy, much bigger than I, both in size of shoulders, etc., and weight in every way. Became a lawyer, and in his practice sued many countries that sponsored terrorism and got huge judgments. For example, he had a judgment against Cuba originally for $2.5 billion, and now it's probably more with interest and costs. It's probably about $3 billion or more.
And the judgment was because?
And because they sponsored a terrorist attack on a U.S. citizen. He has got judgments against Yemen, against various other countries that sponsor terrorism. So he was a very fine lawyer. In fact, almost all of us in the family are lawyers because we always want to be able to fight back against oppression, against bad deeds. Unfortunately, my brother died on his 75th birthday from cancer. I wish he would have continued to live, but he lived a brilliant life, had an outstanding career, and did a lot of good.
Wow. So when you were taken to the orphanage, your brother stayed with your parents?
No, he was not yet born. No.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my sequencing was not perfect. He was born about, I would say approximately 3 months, 4 months after that.
Wow. Another student also wants to know, where did you end up in America and how did you get here? And then an additional question there, how did you meet your wife?
Well, now I'll start with the other one first because that's easy. My wife was a law student. I was practicing law, and she applied for a job in my firm. She didn't get the job, but she got a different job that lasted now 37 years. So we met in a business setting. Initially, there was no romance whatsoever, but we realized that we really liked each other and had a wonderful, terrific partnership. And to this day, 37 years later, we are really partners. That's, I think, the best way of having a marriage. What was the other part of the question?
I don't remember.
Could you help me with that other part?
Of course. They want to know how and when did you make it to America?
Oh, yes. The problem that we had is after we were liberated in Cracow in 1945, I believe it was February 45, my dad did not know it, but he was part of the underground, procuring false identifications to whoever needed it. And that was an underground activity. And so he got a job as a reward of that, got a job in the Polish government. And my dad was an insurance man, so he went to United States. He went to
What
England.
job did he get?
He went to England as a vice minister. Went to Sweden. Went to Switzerland, trying to entice insurance companies to set up branches in Poland, so that other businesses could be insured. So they would make investments in Poland. He had no idea about what the Soviet system was, or what was forbidden, etc. At any rate, he came under the radar or onto the Soviet radar for having made several trips to the West. One night, middle of the night, they came. They took my dad. First went to local jail, trying to figure out what did he do wrong. Never was given charges. And after a couple months, he was told he was going to be sent to Siberia. And meanwhile, my mom knew that he would try to escape. So she sent my brother and I walking across Europe with the displaced persons groups.
How old were you?
And we were going to Palestine before Israel was created. I was 11. My brother was 2. He was riding like a little monkey on my shoulders, and on my back. And off we went. And my dad, good to his word, did in fact escape from one of the prisons on the way to Siberia and joined my mom. They wound up in Paris and they started looking for my brother and I. They found us in southern Austria, Baden, some 40 miles south of Vienna. And we went to Paris, lived there for about 5 months. They still had their diplomatic passports, and of course, which were void because the moment my dad was arrested, the passports were just pieces of paper. And as soon as we got some transportation to the United States, we came by American Airlines, flew into LaGuardia in 1947, and posing as diplomats from Poland. And we arrived. The first home that we set up was in Newburgh, New York. And in 1952, we came to Florida and have been in Florida ever since.
Were you an illegal?
Oh, yes. And we were illegals because the passports that we came on were invalid. So the papers that we had were none at all. But as soon as we told them, the U.S. government 2 years later, that we were here, we were getting asylum. And 7 years later, we became U.S. citizens.
Wow. Another question is, how have you maintained a positive and loving attitude in spite of the horrors you witnessed? And what would you tell students how they can overcome hard things that they face?
Well, first of all, you cannot experience the amount of trauma and insecurity and abject fear that I did without a profound psychological impact. And so I say to the students, be sure that when you don't feel good, when you're scared, when you whatever makes you uncomfortable, if it lasts more than a day or two, go see a counselor, go see a shrink, go see a psychologist. There is an army of people literally waiting for you, waiting to help you. On and off over the years, I've seen psychologists and counselors as briefly as one session or as much as a year and a half. And so I think with their help, I was able to live a productive, happy life. And like everybody else, I try to build a happy life, try to build a career. And by the way, speaking of career, remember, I came to this country. First time I ever saw the inside of a classroom was 5th grade. I still read on 5th grade level. And yet I was able to go through engineering school and law school. And don't let anybody, do not let anybody tell you you can't do something. You find out whether you can do it or not. I read through mountains of books. I still do, reading 250 words a minute. But when my friends, when I was in law school, and my friends went to see movies, I was reading the thick, thick books. When my friends went to play pool, I was reading my books. When my friends were socializing, I was reading the books. Make a long story short, it's not a matter of how smart you are. It's simply a matter of how much you want it. You get help from psychologists, and you work at it, and you can achieve just about everything, anything.
Positive attitude.
Positive attitude. Well, you know, you always have a choice. Every morning, every hour of the day, you wake up and say, am I going to be down, blue now, etc., or am I going to be happy, positive? And so you ask me right now, now my wife's sitting next to me. You ask me, how are you? My answer is always the same. Terrific. I'm great. I feel wonderful. You know what? I may have a pain in the neck, etc. If I say it enough times, believe it or not, I do feel wonderful. I do feel great. I'm happy to be alive. I am. You know, it's simply, you have a choice to be blue, to be down, or to be upbeat. And besides, nobody wants to listen to your trouble. So you're talking to deaf ears. Best thing to do is look at the good sides, be mindful of the bad, of course, but don't let that impact you so that you lose your life, because you can, by a negative attitude, literally squander your life.
Allan, you are an inspiration. You answered the next question, which was, what is advice for future generations? I know that Miss Z wants to come on.
No, I want to answer that question. Here's what my advice is. This is really important. Folks, everything in Poland was great. My grandparents chose to live in Poland rather than the United States because life there was better. What I'm saying to you, the reason I speak, to sound a warning. It can happen here. It can happen to you. And the point I'm trying to make is very simply, get involved in politics, get involved in public life, become, if you will, a candidate, resist wrongdoing, call out the bad actors.
Bullies.
Don't let bullies go, and don't enable bullies by silence. Object, resist, fight back, and you will do well. You will do very well. You might get some bumps and bruises, but believe it, the worst thing that you can do is be silent. Because if you're silent, you are in effect participating with the wrongdoers.
That's right. Thank you for that message. I know the bell rang, but if people are still there, I think Ms. Z wants to come on and say something, John.
I just want to thank you again so much, Mr. Hall, Ms. Coombs, Mr. Shoemaker from EdTech for setting this up, Mr. Loeb. And I just wanted to end with this thought, and this plays right into what Mr. Hall was saying. Why is Mr. Hall's story important? There's so many reasons, but one of them is so that we can fight any kind of atrocity or inequality that we see in the world. And there was a German theologian and pastor who wrote a poem, and he's somebody, even though he was German, he fought against the Nazis. And this is his poem. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Be inspired by Mr. Hall and speak up and speak out. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.